The decommissioned scout ship Perseverance had no official designation anymore. The Navy had stricken her from the registry in the demobilization of 2291, sold her at surplus auction for 11,000 credits, which was an insult to the ship and everyone who'd ever flown one, and Joss had bought her with a severance check and the back-hazard pay they'd finally processed after 8 months of bureaucratic silence, and she had renamed her Maren, after nobody in particular, after a word she'd heard once in a dream she couldn't quite remember, because the ship needed a name that meant something even if Joss couldn't explain what it meant, and because naming things was how you held onto them. She lived in Maren now. Had for 3 years. The cabin was rated for a crew of 4 and Joss used the other 3 bunks for storage. Printouts, hard drives, 2 backup sensor arrays she'd sourced from a salvage dealer in the Corvus station who asked no questions and charged accordingly. The galley unit made adequate coffee if you didn't think too hard about what adequate meant in deep space, and she had learned not to think too hard about most things, because thinking too hard was how you ended up talking to yourself in the dark for 3 years, which she did anyway, but at least she was clear-eyed about it. The Thresh corridor was 40 million kilometers of gravitationally stable approach lane between the Hesper relay and the inner system hub at Caldura station. It was the reason Caldura existed. Before the corridor's survey in 2271, the inner system had been accessible only through the longer routes around the Thresh cloud. 3 extra weeks of transit, significant fuel cost, navigational complexity that kept freight prices high and colonization slow. The corridor changed everything. Once opened, it was the artery through which the inner colonies breathed. Civilian transports, freight haulers, colony ships, medical supply runs. If it was going to the inner system, it went through Thresh. 230 million people lived in the inner system now, and the majority of what they ate, wore, used, breathed, and built arrived through that corridor. Joss had flown it 47 times during the war. She knew its gravitational eddies and its sensor shadow zones and the particular way the Thresh cloud's ambient radiation made certain instrument readings flicker at the corridor's midpoint, which had gotten a rookie pilot killed in 2289 when he'd overcorrected based on a false debris warning and put his wing into a transport he was supposed to be escorting. She knew the corridor the way she knew her own hands. She knew what belonged there. The last day of the war had been the 5th of March, 2290. She had been flying escort on the diplomatic convoy that carried the armistice delegation, rear position, outer wing, which was the assignment you gave pilots you trusted to do nothing while more important things happened in front of them. The Akiri fleet had gathered at the boundary, 312 vessels by the official count, hulking military-grade warships that made humanity's assembled response force look like a school project, and then, because the treaty had been signed 2 days prior and the war was already over in every sense that mattered, and this was theater now, they had turned and burned for the border in formation, and it had been, genuinely, the most magnificent and terrifying thing Joss had ever seen. Because 312 ships moving in coordinated departure looked like watching a continent decide to leave. She had counted. She always counted. It was a habit her first wing commander had drilled into her so thoroughly it had become reflex. You counted assets coming and you counted assets going and you didn't trust anyone else's count because no one else's count was your count. 312 arriving. The treaty delegations had been saying 312 for a week. Every official tally confirmed 312. Joss counted 311 leaving. She reported it. Of course she reported it. She keyed the wing commander on the escort frequency and said she had a count discrepancy, 1 vessel unaccounted for, and the wing commander, Prevet, good pilot, decent man, exhausted in the particular way of people who had survived something and were desperately trying to believe it was over, told her to run her count again. She ran her count again. 311. She reported it again. Prevet told her the official count was confirmed by 6 independent sources, and the discrepancy was likely a sensor artifact given the ambient interference from the fleet's drive signatures, and would she please maintain position and let the diplomats have their moment. She maintained position. She watched 311 Akiri ships cross the border. She filed a formal discrepancy report that afternoon, before the celebration had even properly started, before the bottles were open in the officers' mess. She wrote it carefully and completely, the count, the methodology, the timestamps, the sensor logs. She submitted it through proper channels. She received an automated confirmation. 3 days later she received a reply from a lieutenant commander she had never heard of, informing her that her report had been reviewed, that the discrepancy was consistent with known sensor artifacts in high-density fleet operations, and that the official count of 312 departing vessels had been confirmed by all relevant intelligence assets, and that she should consider the matter resolved. She did not consider the matter resolved. She was not unaware of what she looked like. She had sat with it, really sat with it, the way you sit with the possibility that you are the wrong one. 6 independent sources against 1 tired pilot at the back of the formation, the war ending, everyone wanting it to end, everyone's instruments agreeing with everyone else's instruments. She had built the alternative hypothesis and examined it honestly. Sensor artifact, fatigue error, miscounting in the chaos of 300 vessels burning simultaneously, some legitimate explanation she wasn't clear to know. She had given that hypothesis every advantage she could. Then she had bought Maren and started watching. The first months were the hardest, because she had nothing. She was watching a corridor full of shipping traffic and scattered debris and the ordinary visual noise of a busy transit lane, looking for something she could not precisely describe, an absence, a shape that was wrong, a sensor reading that didn't quite fit. She developed the logging system gradually, building it from software she wrote herself because she didn't want the data in any system that anyone else could access and potentially dismiss or sanitize. Every pass she made through the outer Thresh approach, she recorded everything. Full-spectrum sensor sweeps, gravitational gradient readings, electromagnetic emissions mapping, visual survey on every available wavelength. The files were enormous. She developed compression algorithms. She filled 3 hard drives in the first year and ordered 6 more. The debris pattern was what first gave it away. Thresh corridor debris was well mapped. 30 years of surveying in transit had produced detailed charts of the larger debris clusters, remnants of the cloud that the corridor threaded through, frozen volatiles and silicate chunks that were too small to pose serious navigational hazards but large enough to show on instruments. Every ship that transited the corridor contributed passive sensor data to the charts. The charts were good. Joss knew them as well as she knew anything. In her 8th month of watching, she noticed that a particular debris cluster in the corridor's outer approach, cluster designation TC 7741, roughly 2 kilometers across, mostly frozen ammonia and silicate, no navigational significance, was casting a gravitational shadow that didn't match its charted mass. Not by much. By exactly the amount that a Curie frigate-class vessel, running cold with minimal active systems, would add if it were nestled within the cluster. She noted it. She ran the calculation 4 times. She held it at arm's length for 2 weeks, examining it for every possible alternative explanation, and then she went back through her sensor archives and found the same gravitational anomaly. Faint, consistent, unmistakable once you knew to look, in every survey she had run since the beginning. It had been there the whole time. She had been looking through it without seeing it. Then she started watching the anomaly specifically, and the anomaly moved. Not immediately. Not obviously. Over the course of the next 8 months, she documented 7 position changes, small, always drifting with the corridor's natural debris flow, always maintaining the same apparent profile as the cluster it had embedded itself within. Perfectly patient. Perfectly dark. She began correlating the movements with shipping traffic patterns, and that was when the 47-day interval emerged, because the Thresh corridor's civilian traffic followed predictable scheduling cycles and the ship. She was certain now it was a ship, certain in the way you were certain about things you'd proven to yourself 600 times. The ship repositioned on a cycle that tracked almost exactly with the convoy schedule, moving 43 to 44 days before each major civilian transit took place. Itself at optimal intercept position. It was waiting. It had been waiting for 3 years, patient and dark and utterly still, and it had not acted, and Joss had developed 2 theories about why it had not acted, and she found neither of them comforting. Either the operation required something she hadn't accounted for, a signal, a threshold, a condition not yet met, or it was simply waiting for the moment when human vigilance, as she had known it would, finally collapsed under the weight of 3 years of peace. 43 days now. The pattern said 43 days. She opened a fresh log file and began writing. She went to Caldura Station because it was the closest major hub with a Navy presence, and because she had a name, Commander Elise Turov, who had been her wing commander superior during the war and who had, once, in a briefing Joss was barely senior enough to attend, made a comment about post-war monitoring that suggested she was not entirely convinced the piece was as tidy as advertised. The Navy's administrative office on Caldura was located in the station's Searing, between a freight brokerage and a noodle restaurant, and it smelled of recycled air and form processing and the particular institutional despair of a military bureaucracy operating in peacetime. Joss had made an appointment. She had a folder, physical paper, because paper couldn't be dismissed as a corrupted file, containing 3 years of sensor logs, calculations, positional correlations, and a summary document she had rewritten 11 times to make it as spare and precise and unassailable as she could make it. Turov's adjutant kept her waiting for 40 minutes. This was fine. Joss could wait. Turov received her in a small office that was cluttered in the way of people who had too much work and not enough filing, and she listened. Joss gave her that, she genuinely listened, for 12 minutes before she said anything. What she said was, "You understand that this is the same report you filed in March of 2290. The same underlying observation," Joss said. 3 years of additional supporting data. Turov looked at the folder. Private sensor logs from a decommissioned vessel. The logs include calibration records. The instruments are rated to Navy standard. I had them certified at Corvus Station. The certification documents are in the back. I see them. Turov was quiet for a moment. Pilot, Warrant Officer Chen, your service record is. I'm not a warrant officer anymore. Your service record, Turov said, with a slight emphasis of someone declining to engage with an interruption, is excellent. Genuinely excellent. You were a fine pilot and the Navy was sorry to lose you. She closed the folder. Which is why I want to be honest with you rather than just processing this through the desk and sending you an automated response. What you're describing, one ship, hidden in debris, for 3 years, without acting, does not fit any Akiri operational pattern we have on record. Their doctrine is strike and withdraw. They don't embed long-term. They never have. Maybe this is new doctrine. Or maybe it's a gravitational anomaly in an imprecisely surveyed debris cluster. I accounted for survey imprecision. The margin of error calculation is on page. I see it. Turov pushed the folder back across the desk, gently. I'll log this. I'll make sure it's reviewed by someone with appropriate clearance. But I want you to know, as honestly as I can tell you, the probability that this rises to the level of an actionable intelligence concern is very low, and the probability that any response can be organized in the time frame you're describing is effectively 0. 43 days is not a long planning horizon for a naval deployment. It's long enough to divert one patrol vessel. One patrol vessel to do what? Investigate a gravitational anomaly in a debris cluster. To be present, Joss said. To be present in the corridor when the convoy transits. So that if I'm right, there's someone there who can do something about it. Turov looked at her for a long moment. There was something in the look that was not entirely dismissive, a flicker of something that might have been genuine unease, quickly reorganized into the professional neutrality of someone who had learned to be careful about what she let herself believe. I'll log the report, she said. That's what I can promise you. It was not enough. Joss had known it wouldn't be, but she'd had to try Turov first because the alternative was admitting she'd exhausted official channels and was now doing something else, and doing something else required a contact she wasn't sure she could find. His name was Ciro Van, and she'd heard of him the way you heard of anyone in the informal network of people who'd been close enough to the wars seems to know where the official history had been smoothed over. He was half Akiri. His mother had been a systems engineer in the Akiri fleet, his father a human logistics contractor who'd been working the border stations before everything went wrong, and he'd served in the Akiri military for 11 years before resigning his commission in the aftermath of the armistice under circumstances that the Akiri government described as personal, and that people who knew better described as, he found out something and they let him leave because the alternative was worse. He was 41 now, lived on a mid-ring station called Varent in the border-adjacent space, ran a small navigation consulting business, and had not, as far as Joss could determine, spoken publicly about anything related to the Akiri military since his resignation. She had spent 6 months deciding whether to contact him. Not because she doubted the decision in principle, but because she understood what it meant. If she contacted Van, she was no longer the pilot who filed the discrepancy report through proper channels and kept watching. She was something else. The something else had always been where this was going, she thought. She'd just been making herself walk the proper channels first so she could say, later, that she had. She sent a message to his registered address on Varent. Plain text, no encryption that would flag it, nothing that would look like anything other than what she said it was. A former Navy pilot seeking consulting advice on Akiri operational patterns for what she described as a private security contract. She included enough specifics, the 47-day interval, the phrase, embedded dormancy profile, to tell him, if he was the person she'd been told he was, that she was not talking about a security contract. He replied in 4 days. The reply was brief. When can you be at Varent? She was at Varent in 6. Van met her at the docking ring personally, which she hadn't expected, and she found herself recalibrating within the first 30 seconds. She had built an image of him in her head from fragments. The naval record, the resignation, the silence. She had imagined someone worn down, wary, carrying the weight of whatever he'd left behind. He was wary, certainly. But he was also contained in the way of people who had found the bottom of something and come up from it. Not healed, exactly, but settled, the way a ship settles into a dock, knowing where it is. He was visibly Akiri in the way half Akiri people were, the slight elongation of the fingers, the secondary eyelid that was mostly translucent in humans with mixed heritage, the particular quality of stillness that full Akiri had and that diluted, in people like Van, into something that just looked like exceptional patience. He was taller than she'd expected. He shook her hand like a human and didn't say anything unnecessary, which she appreciated. They went to his office, which was a converted cargo module attached to the station's outer ring, and he made tea, proper tea, not the galley unit approximation, and he listened to her present the data with the same quality of attention he'd apparently brought to their introductions, total and quiet and evaluating. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, looking at the positional charts she'd laid out on his work table. "How confident are you in the 47-day interval?" he said. 17 complete cycles observed. The variance is less than 6 hours across all 17. 6 hours. He looked up. That's not an interval. That's a schedule. Yes. He looked back at the charts. The Thresh convoy in 44 days. Yes. He said something in Akiri, low and quiet, and then caught himself and said, "I'm sorry. I do that when I'm processing something I don't want to be processing." "What did you say?" He was quiet for a moment. Roughly translated, a patient blade is a patient blade. It's a phrase. It was used in Akiri military doctrine to describe a class of operation. Long-term embedded assets, dormant until conditions are met. It was considered a fringe doctrine. Strategically unattractive because the timeline is too long and the operational security demands are too high and the ship's crew, he stopped. What about the crew? The crew of a long-term embedded asset is not expected to return, he said. The operation is, by definition, a sacrifice play. The asset activates, completes the objective, and is destroyed either by the target's response or by the operator's conclusion protocol. He looked at her. The Akiri commanders who advocated for this doctrine called it Vthrackak. The ones who opposed it called it what it is, suicide doctrine. But someone deployed it. Someone deployed it. He pushed one of her charts aside and laid his hands flat on the table in the way of a person organizing his thoughts by organizing his body. I left the Akiri military because I found evidence that a faction within the command structure, not the government, not the official military command, a faction, had been maintaining operations that were not sanctioned by the armistice. The government signed in good faith. I believe that. But there are people within the Akiri military infrastructure who did not accept the armistice as final, who viewed it as a pause, a reorganization. He said the last word with a particular precision that told her it was a translation of something uglier. I tried to report it internally. I was told I was mistaken. I was encouraged, very strongly, to resign. And you did. I had a daughter by then, he said simply. So yes. Joss was quiet for a moment. Then, if it's Vthrackak, what's the activation condition? What triggers it? I don't know the specific protocol for this asset. But the doctrine as I understood it required either a command signal or a preset temporal condition, a date or elapsed time after a specified event. He looked at the charts again. If it's temporal, if the condition is simply that a certain amount of time has elapsed since the armistice. 3 years, Joss said. 3 years, he said. Yes. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The convoy is the largest civilian transit through Thresh in the past 18 months, Joss said. 42 vessels. 11,000 passengers. I know. He looked at her directly. What do you need from me? I need to know if I'm crazy. You're not crazy. He said it without hesitation or consolation, as a simple statement of verified fact. What else? I need someone to help me convince the Navy that this is real. I've been to Turov. She logged my report and sent me home. I have contacts, he said. Some of them still listen to me. Some of them don't, because of what my name means to them now. He picked up the positional chart with the 17-cycle overlay and looked at it closely. This is meticulous work. 3 years. Yes. He set it down carefully. I'll reach out to my contacts tonight. You should know, the probability that official channels move fast enough is low. Your timeline is 43 days. I know. You have a ship. I do. He looked at her with the stillness she'd noticed when they first met, and there was something in it now, not pity, not admiration exactly, but recognition. The specific recognition of someone who understood what it meant to be the only person who knew something terrible and to have to decide what to do about it alone. Then I think, he said carefully, that you should also begin preparing for the possibility that you will have to address this yourself. I know, she said again. She slept on Maren in the dock that night, and she did not sleep well, and in the morning she started going through the ship systems with the focused attention of someone who is preparing for something and wants to know exactly what she has to work with. Devan's contacts produced 11 days of hope and then silence. The hope was real, briefly. An admiral named Castavar, who had been, Van explained, one of the few senior naval officers who'd maintained a minority position that the post-war monitoring protocols were insufficient, requested Joss's full data package and a personal briefing, which she provided via secure transmission from Varant. Castavar's office confirmed receipt. His intelligence liaison asked 3 follow-up questions that were precise and detailed and showed genuine engagement with the material. Joss permitted herself, for about 48 hours, to believe that the mechanism was going to work, that the right person had finally seen the right evidence and the weight of the institution would turn toward the problem. Then Castavar's office went quiet. Not dismissively quiet, not the automated response and the closed case. Just quiet. Her follow-up messages were acknowledged but not replied to in substance. When Van reached out through his own channel, he was told that the matter was under review. Under review, Joss had learned over the course of her adult life, was what institutions said when they had decided something but didn't want to say it yet. She had 32 days left. She spent them in the following way. She spent 7 of them on Varant with Van, going through everything she knew and everything he knew and building the most complete picture they could manage, because even if she was going alone, and she was going alone, she had known she was going alone since roughly the 4th day of the 11 days of hope, she wanted to know as much as she could before she went. She spent 12 of the remaining days flying Maren back toward Thresh and running the approach scenarios, mapping the specific debris clusters that surrounded TC 7741 and calculating the angles from which a small fast vessel could approach without triggering the defensive sensor profile that Van had described as standard for a Vthrackak asset. She spent 8 of those days in a state of concentrated preparation that she could only maintain by not thinking about what she was doing and only thinking about how she was doing it, and she spent the remaining 5 days being very afraid. The fear was specific and useful, which was the only kind of fear she had any patience for. She was afraid in the following ways. She was afraid that she was wrong and there was nothing in TC 7741 and she would have spent 3 years of her life watching empty space. She was afraid that she was right and she would not be fast enough, skilled enough, or lucky enough to stop what was in there. She was afraid that she was right and she would stop it and no one would ever know, because the Navy would write up whatever debris it found as an anomaly and seal the report, and she would know that she had been right all along and it would have made no difference to the record. She was afraid that she was right and she would stop it and she would not survive the stopping. The last fear was the least interesting to her, which told her something about herself that she had known for a long time and had mostly made peace with. Van called her on the 14th day of her transit. Castavar's been moved to a different posting, he said. Lateral transfer. Official reason is rotation. Real reason is he pushed too hard on the monitoring question and someone above him decided the war was over and it was going to stay over. How long ago? The order came through yesterday. His office will stand down in 10 days. 10 days. The convoy was in 31. She ran the number without meaning to, the way she ran all numbers without meaning to, the arithmetic of the situation just processing automatically while she held the phone and listened to Van breathing on the other end of the transmission. There's one more option, he said. There's a joint human-Akiri oversight body, the Armistice Commission. They have independent authority to authorize naval action if they determine there's a credible treaty violation. I can get a report to their independent auditor. He's a good man. But the commission moves slowly. How slowly? Their standard review period is 60 days. She said nothing. I know, he said. I'm going in. Another pause. Then, I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about the approach vectors. The asset will have active sensors in its forward hemisphere, that's doctrine. Its rear hemisphere will be running passive only, to conserve power for the dormancy profile. If you come in from the trailing edge of the TC 7741 cluster, you'll be in its passive zone until you're very close. How close? 800 meters, maybe. At that range it will pick you up regardless. I just need it not to pick me up until I'm close enough to do something useful. Yes. He gave her the specific debris configuration details he'd been working out, the drift rates, the sight lines, the gap in the cluster's eastern face that would let her thread through without going dark. Going dark meant cutting her drive signature, and cutting her drive signature meant she was coasting, and coasting meant she had no maneuverability if it went wrong, so she was not going dark if she could avoid it. Joss, he said, when they'd been through all of it. Yes. I want you to know that I believe you. I believed you the first time you showed me the data, and I believe you now. Whatever happens, I want you to know that someone knows you're right. She sat with that for a moment. It was, she realized, the thing she had needed to hear for 3 years, and it didn't solve anything, and it didn't change what she was doing, and it helped her more than she could account for. Thank you, she said. Keep working the commission. If it goes well, there'll be debris to explain. If it goes badly, there'll be debris to explain, and someone might want to know why it's there. I'll be listening on the common frequencies. Don't, she said. I'll be radio silent. Any transmission can be picked up. Then I'll just be waiting. She flew toward Thresh. 28 days out, she did a full systems audit of Maren, drives, sensors, comms, the small defensive countermeasures package she'd had installed 8 months ago when she'd started thinking seriously about what she was going to do if the clock ran out. The countermeasures were modest: 2 short-range ECM pods that could disrupt targeting sensors, a chaff dispenser, and a single short-burst kinetic projector that had been rated as a debris-clearing tool in the sales documentation but was, as the salvage dealer at Corvith had noted with a carefully neutral expression, rated to the same output spec as a light naval deterrent weapon. She had not asked follow-up questions about that, and neither had he. 14 days out, she stopped sleeping more than 4 hours at a time, because she kept waking with the certainty that she'd miscounted, that the interval was wrong, that the ship had already moved or already activated, and she would sit in the dark of the cabin with her sensor feed open on the secondary display and watch the readings from TC 7741 and reassure herself that the gravitational anomaly was still there, still consistent, still patient. 6 days out, she ate very little and ran scenarios in her head until the scenarios stopped producing new information, and she made herself eat something and sleep for 6 hours and then ran the scenarios again. 3 days out, she recorded a message for Van. Everything she knew, laid out as completely as she could lay it out, every calculation and every observation and every conclusion, in case she didn't come back and in case it mattered later that someone had this. She compressed it and encoded it and stored it in a dead-drop server she'd registered under a false name 2 years ago for exactly this purpose, and she sent Van the access credentials with a note that said, "Open in 30 days if you don't hear from me before." Then she turned her full attention to flying. The corridor at its outer approach was beautiful in the way of places that were not built for beauty and achieved it anyway. The Thresh cloud's outer boundary was a gradient, not the hard edge you'd expect from the charts, but a slow dissolution, ice crystals and silicate dust thinning into the black in a way that scattered the distant star's light into something almost prismatic if you looked at it in the right wavelengths, which Joss sometimes did when she needed to remember why the universe was worth the trouble of defending. She was looking at it now, on the visual feed, giving herself 30 seconds of it, because she knew what was ahead and she wanted something to hold in her head that was not about what was ahead. Then she closed the visual feed and started working. TC 7741 was 11 hours away at her current approach speed, which she had set low deliberately. Low drive output, low heat signature, maintaining the profile of a slow-moving salvage prospector, which was a cover she'd used for 3 years and which she trusted to be consistent and boring and unworthy of attention. The corridor had moderate traffic today. 3 freighters on standard transit, 2 of them slower bulk haulers, 1 fast courier. None of them would pay attention to her. She began the approach sequence Van had outlined, the drift through the cluster's trailing edge, using the existing debris flow to give her movement a naturalistic pattern. It took 4 hours of careful work, adjusting her approach in increments so small they were nearly invisible on her own instruments, threading between debris clusters with the patience that 3 years of watching TC-7741 had thoroughly installed in her. She was not hurrying. Hurrying was how you got detected. She flew the way the debris flew, slow and dark and inevitable. At 1,400 meters, her gravitational sensors resolved the anomaly into something unmistakable. The ship was there. She had known it intellectually for 3 years, and now she knew it in her body, the way you knew things when the sensor readings stopped being abstract data and started being real. A vessel, roughly frigate class, 140 meters from bow to stern, tucked into the eastern face of the cluster with the patient precision of something that had been placed there very carefully by people who were very good at their work. She stopped breathing for a moment. Then she started again and kept working. At 900 meters she picked up the passive sensor emissions, low-level sweeps, just enough to maintain situational awareness without broadcasting a detectable active signal. Van had been right. She was at the edge of its passive zone. She had maybe 2 more minutes before. The ship moved. Not the full activation she'd been dreading, not the drive spooling up, not weapons free. A slight rotation, barely 10 degrees, the kind of adjustment you made when a passive sensor had picked up something ambiguous and you were reorienting to get a better read. It had seen something. Not her, not specifically. Something in the debris flow that her passage had disturbed. She had maybe 40 seconds. She made a decision in the time it took to make a decision, which was no time at all, which was the gift that 3 years of preparation gave you. Not that you'd thought of everything, but that you'd thought long enough that when the moment came you were already ahead of it. She cut the slow approach profile, power her drive to 40%, not full, 40, because full would light her up on every instrument in the ship's forward hemisphere, and she was still not in its forward hemisphere, and she came around the cluster's eastern edge on a tight arc that put her on the ship's blind side at maximum approach speed she could manage while staying in the passive zone. At 400 meters the ship fully rotated and she was in its forward hemisphere. She saw the weapons lock light up on her sensor board and she hit the ECM pod and cut her own instruments to emergency passive and swung Maren hard to port on pure muscle memory, and the targeting beam swept across her position and found nothing solid because the ECM was doing its job and she was already not where she'd been. The Akiri ship was moving now, drives firing, the dormancy profile abandoning itself in the face of a close contact, and Joss had expected this and she was already moving, already placing herself in the geometry she'd spent 14 days flying in her head. The Thresh corridor at this point was 40 million kilometers wide in the charts. In practice, in the space between TC-7741 and the next major debris cluster 600 kilometers to the north, the navigable space was considerably smaller, because the debris fields to either side were dense enough to be genuinely hazardous at speed, and Joss knew which specific paths through them were flyable, and she doubted very much that the Akiri pilot did. She went into the debris. Not recklessly, with the specific, granular knowledge of someone who had surveyed this cluster from every angle over 3 years, who knew which of those frozen silicate chunks were charted and which weren't, who knew the exact drift rates and the rotation patterns of the larger pieces and could predict, within a narrow margin, where each of them would be in the next 3 minutes. She flew through the cluster the way water moved through rock, finding the spaces that were actually there rather than the spaces that looked like they were there, and she was fast, pushing Maren to 80%, and the Akiri ship followed her. It was a good pilot. She had to concede that, even in the moment. A good pilot and a smaller vessel than she'd expected. The mass readings had suggested frigate class, but it was running light, stripped down for the long dormancy, and it was maneuverable, more maneuverable than she'd planned for. And it came into the debris cluster after her with a confidence that surprised her, and she had to revise her geometry on the fly, because the geometry had assumed a larger ship with less agility, and she was now in a debris field with a vessel that could match her. Turns. The first pass happened fast. She came out of the cluster's southern edge, and the Akiri ship was there, 200 meters to her right, and they were both moving at speed, and the targeting beams swept across her hull, and she felt Maren shudder with the proximity of it, which was not a physical effect but was absolutely a physical sensation. And she put the chaff out and jinked hard, and the targeting solution dissolved, and she went back into the debris before it could reacquire. 90 meters. She'd been 90 meters from a weapons solution. She knew because she'd been tracking the Akiri ship's sensor emissions, and she knew what a targeting solution looked like when it was forming, and she'd been inside the formation window, and she was alive because she'd been moving. She stopped moving, briefly. That was the second decision, the one that required trusting the 3 years absolutely. She stopped moving and she went cold, sitting still in a gap between 3 large debris chunks, her drive at 0, her heat signature bleeding down, her instruments passive only, and she held that stillness while the Akiri ship moved through the cluster looking for her. It came past at 60 meters. 60 meters. She could see it on the visual feed, the hull detail, the weapons array on its forward face, the slight scoring along its port side that spoke of 3 years even in vacuum, 3 years of dormancy wearing on the metal in ways that space always wore on things. She could see the sensor array rotating. She brought the kinetic projector to ready. The Akiri ship was past her, angling north, looking for her in the direction she had not gone. It was going to figure it out. In another 10 seconds, its sensor array was going to complete its sweep and find the heat signature she was still generating despite everything, and it was going to turn and she was going to have a 1-second window, or she was not going to have a window at all. She fired at 9 seconds. The kinetic burst hit the Akiri ship's aft drive assembly, the thing she'd been aiming for since she'd first seen the hull detail on the visual feed. The specific configuration Van had told her about because Akiri frigate-class vessels of this generation had their primary drive manifold exposed on the aft starboard quarter in a way that human vessels didn't, because Akiri naval architecture prioritized different things, and the exposed manifold was the price of the maneuverability advantage. The burst hit the manifold casing, and the casing ruptured, and the drive vented in a controlled catastrophic decompression that spun the ship 40 degrees off its heading and killed its primary propulsion. It was not destroyed. It had secondary drives, and it had weapons, and it had a crew. She didn't know how many, had never known how many. A Vthrackak asset ran minimal crew, and she estimated 3, maybe 4, who were alive and operational and very angry, and it had 40 seconds before it could stabilize and bring its weapons to bear from the secondary drive platform. She used 30 of those seconds to get inside its defensive perimeter. This was the part of the scenario she had spent the most time on in the 14 days of transit, because it was the part that she could not fully plan, the part that depended on things she wouldn't know until she was in it. The Vthrackak doctrine specified a self-destruct protocol. If the asset was at risk of capture or its operation was compromised, the crew was to destroy the vessel and all records aboard. She could not allow that. She needed the ship intact. She needed its logs. She brought Maren in to 30 meters off the Akiri ship's port airlock, and she activated her docking collar's magnetic system, and she attached herself to the hull of a ship that was still trying to kill her, and then she broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, in Akiri and in Standard, a message she had composed during the 14 days of transit. I am not Navy. I am not a threat to your people. I am one pilot in one decommissioned vessel. I have disabled your drive. I can disable your weapons from this position. I can also disengage, and we both know what happens then. My kinetic projector is loaded and I have your manifold geometry mapped. We can do this quietly, or we can do this the other way. I am asking you to choose quietly. She waited. The Akiri ship stopped trying to reorient its weapons. She didn't know if that was the message or just the mechanics of their situation. At 30 meters, they were inside their own weapon's minimum safe arming distance, but she held the position and she kept breathing and she waited. After 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the Akiri ship's comms opened. The voice was very young. She hadn't expected that. Young and exhausted and something else, something that it took her a moment to identify, and what she identified it as was relief. The voice said, in halting Standard, "We have been here for 3 years." "I know," she said. A long pause. The activation signal never came. We kept waiting for the activation signal. 3 years. Another pause. We have 18 days of food supply left. The activation signal had never come. Someone in the faction had lost their nerve, or been removed, or died, or the signal architecture had failed, and the ship had waited in the dark for 3 years past the point when it expected to die for something, and it had not died, and the signal had never come, and the crew of 3, she found out later it was 3, 2 very young pilots and a systems officer who was 26, had eaten their supplies and watched their food run down and waited. She spent 4 hours attached to that hull, negotiating a process that she was making up as she went. She was not Navy. She had no legal authority, she was one decommissioned pilot with a jury-rigged weapon system, and she was nonetheless the only option available. In the end, she agreed to carry them as passengers on Maren to the nearest station with a medical facility, and in exchange they would transmit her the complete ship's log archive before they left. She thought, briefly, about what Turov would say. She thought about the 60-day review period of the Armistice Commission. She thought about Kastavar's lateral transfer and the automated response to her 2290 report. She accepted their transmission, and she started flying toward the station. She processed the logs in transit. She had expected it to be slow going, The Akiri military used encryption standards she was partially familiar with from her Navy service and partially not, and she had built a decryption toolkit over the past 2 years of preparation that she thought would handle most of it, but she wasn't certain. The toolkit handled most of it. The operational logs decrypted in 6 hours, and she read them on the secondary display while Maren flew and the 3 young Akiri crew members slept in the aft bunks, 2 of them together in the same bunk because they had apparently been doing that for comfort for the last several months, and she didn't comment on it. The logs were meticulous. She had expected that. Akiri military culture prized documentation, Van had told her, even in clandestine operations, perhaps especially in clandestine operations, because the faction that ran Vthrackak expected history to vindicate them and wanted the record complete. The crew of TC-7741's embedded asset had logged everything. The dormancy procedures, the equipment maintenance, the food consumption, the communications protocols, the twice-daily checks for the activation signal that never came. They had logged their own deterioration with a spare, factual precision that she found, in a way she hadn't expected, very hard to read. Day 1094. Pilot Servass experiencing significant psychological distress. Recommended she sleep in the forward compartment for a period. She declined to be separated from the crew. They had been, all 3 of them, 22 years old when they were deployed. The activation protocol was in there. She read it twice. It specified a command signal from a designated relay, and the relay was listed, and the relay's designation she didn't recognize, but she ran it against the navigation database, and the relay corresponded to an unmanned communications node in the outer Akiri system that had apparently been placed there at some point during the war as part of an infrastructure project. Someone in the faction held the activation codes for that relay. Someone had been waiting for the right moment. That was the last thing she expected to find. The thing she had not expected was the operational context document, which was filed under a classification header that her toolkit flagged as one of the highest-level Akiri designations she'd encountered. She spent an additional 2 hours getting through the encryption on that document, and she read it in full twice, and then she read it again. Vthrackak deployment was listed. The assets were enumerated. Their positions were listed in coordinates that she began translating with hands that she realized, distantly, were not quite steady. Not shaking, she was past shaking, but not quite still. The coordinates resolved against the navigation database one by one, and she mapped them, and the map produced the following: 18 vessels. TC-7741's asset, now disabled and in her possession. And 17 more. She stayed where she was for a long time. 17 more ships, in 17 more debris clusters, and the coordinates were not all in the Thresh corridor, they were distributed. 3 near the HSY relay. 2 at the Caldura outer approach. 4 along the Maren shipping lane, which was the second largest transit corridor in the inner system approach. Others near stations, near communication relays, near the infrastructure of everything humanity had built in the inner system on the assumption that the war was over and the peace was real. She thought about what they had been waiting for. She thought about the 3 young people sleeping in her aft bunks, who had been 22 when someone had pointed them at a debris cluster and told them to wait for a signal, and she thought about the crews of 17 more ships who were out there right now, waiting, and she thought about whether some of them were also out of food, also falling apart quietly in the dark, also waiting for a signal from a relay that had never sent it. She thought about the 11,000 passengers on the convoy that was now, by her calculation, 40 days away. And the convoys after that. And the transports to the HSY relay and the Caldura approach and the Maren lane. She thought about Turov, who had listened carefully and logged the report and sent her home. She thought about Kastivar, who had pushed and been moved to a different posting. She thought about Van, who had found the bottom of something and come up from it, who had said "You're not crazy" without hesitation, and who was waiting on Varant for word from her. She thought about the 3 years she had spent watching. The automated navigation alert chimed. The station was 4 hours out. She needed to contact ahead, arrange the medical check-in for the crew, figure out the procedural architecture of arriving at a civilian station with 3 Akiri military personnel whose presence here was technically not possible according to any official record. She needed to contact Van. She needed to rebuild the report, not the report she'd been filing for 3 years, but a new one, with the logs, with the coordinates, with everything, and she needed to figure out how to make it land differently this time. She needed to figure out how to make 17 ships' worth of evidence land differently than 1 ship's worth of evidence had. She opened a new transmission file. She began composing the message to Van, not the dead drop message, the real one, because she was coming back and she had what she'd gone for, and now she needed him the way she'd always known she was going to need him. She wrote, "I have the logs. I have the activation protocol. I have coordinates. There are 17 more." Then she paused, and she looked at the navigation display, at Maren's heading, at the 4-hour line to the station, and the rest of the map beyond it. She thought about what it meant that the activation signal had never come. Someone had planned this and then not pulled the trigger. 3 years of patience and then, not nothing, because the ships were still out there, still waiting, still capable of being activated by a signal from a relay that someone still controlled. But a hesitation. A pause. An opening. She thought about all the things that could close an opening. She attached the partial log files to the message, not the full archive. She'd send that separately encrypted, but enough that Van would know she wasn't wrong, couldn't possibly be wrong, that this time there would be no automated response and no lateral transfer and no 60-day review period, because this time she had the ship itself and the crew and the coordinates. This time the evidence was not a gravitational anomaly in a debris cluster. This time the evidence was irrefutable and documented, and sitting in her aft bunks sleeping with their arms around each other. She sent the message. Then she looked at the coordinates again. 17 ships. The map of them resolved in her head, the way maps did, the way the Thresh corridor had resolved for her at 11 hours out into something she could feel as well as read, a geometry of the situation that she inhabited rather than just observed. 17 ships at 17 positions, and she had the positions. She had the coordinates. She had a ship, and she had fuel, and she ran the calculation without meaning to, the arithmetic of the situation processing automatically the way it always processed. She had approximately 340 days before the faction ran out of patience or decided to use a different relay or change the protocol in ways she couldn't predict, because 340 days was her estimate for how long it would take official channels to turn the evidence she had into something that moved, and that was optimistic. She thought, "I know where they are." The station alert chimed again. 3 hours and 50 minutes. She thought, "I know where all of them are." She had the coordinates. She had 3 years of debris cluster analysis and sensor methodology and the specific terrible patience of someone who had spent a long time being right about something in the dark. She had one decommissioned scout ship that she had named after a word from a dream she couldn't quite remember. She had enough fuel for, she ran the calculation, a long time. She had no authority and no mandate and no backup and no plan beyond the plan that had gotten her this far, which was to fly toward the thing no one else was flying toward and not stop until she understood it. 17 ships. 17 debris clusters, at positions she now knew. The station was ahead. She would deliver the crew. She would send the full archive to Van. She would file the report, again, differently, with everything she had, and she would wait to see what official channels did with evidence that could not be dismissed, and she would help them in every way she could, and she would also, because she understood now, the way she understood the Thresh corridor, the way she understood the 47-day interval, the way she understood the shape of things when you'd looked at them long enough, she would also not wait. She pulled up the navigation computer and entered the first coordinates from the archive. The NAV system queried, "Destination undefined. Confirm routing." She confirmed. Then she set a waypoint for the station, 4 hours out, and she held the heading, and she thought about 17 ships full of young people who were waiting for a signal in the dark, and she thought about everything that could happen if someone sent that signal before she got there, and she thought about everything that could happen if she did get there, and she thought about the particular quality of patience that she had been building for 3 years. Not the patience of waiting, but the patience of watching, which was a different thing, which was an active thing, which was the patience of someone who had decided that the watching was her job and was doing it regardless of whether anyone else understood that it was necessary. Maren flew. The corridor opened ahead of her, the Thresh cloud gradating into black at its edges, the stars beyond it burning with the indifference of things that had no idea the war was supposed to be over. She held her course. She checked the navigation display one more time, the waypoint for the station, the coordinates beyond it, the long line of destinations she was already, in her mind, already flying. She started flying.